I've been very lucky to have this kind of career that's nice and spread because most careers can be up and down very quickly. I'm just very pleased.
Diana Ross is now 82, and how she lives is beyond sad. Almost everyone who once defined her world has already disappeared. The voices that built Motown's golden age are gone. The rivals who once shared the same charts have fallen silent, and the era she helped create has been fully archived in history books. Yet she remains on stage, carrying something heavier than fame: the memory of a vanished industry, a lost city of sound, and a cultural moment that no longer exists anywhere except in her recollection. To make any sense of it all, we must start from the very beginning. A typo, a tuberculosis crisis, and a girl determined to run away. March 26, 1944, Detroit, Michigan. A clerical error renamed the newborn Diane Ernestine Earl Ross to Diana. Seems like fate, doesn't it? She grew up in Detroit's North End at 635 Belmont Street, a dense, working-class neighborhood where survival was measured in proximity and routine rather than comfort. Across the street lived a boy who would also become part of music history, Smokey Robinson. At the time, neither child knew that Detroit was quietly assembling what would become Motown, a cultural machine that would export their voices across the world. Before that could happen, though, tragedy struck. Around age 7, Ross's mother, Ernestine, developed tuberculosis, a diagnosis that in mid-20th century America often meant long separations, strict isolation, and uncertain recovery timelines. The illness forced the family into fragmentation. Children were sent to relatives, routines broke apart, and stability became conditional on medical outcomes. By 1958, the Ross family moved into the Brewster Douglas housing projects, one of Detroit's largest and most well-known public housing developments. Built in the 1930s and expanded during wartime housing demands, it became a dense ecosystem of families navigating economic pressure in close quarters. It was here that chance began assembling what would later be marketed as destiny. In the hallways and courtyards, Ross met Mary Wilson and Florence Ballard, two girls whose shared environment would eventually crystallize into the Supremes. The housing projects were not glamorous, but they were structured like a training ground for ambition. Music traveled through stairwells from radios tuned to gospel stations and emerging R&B broadcasts. Teenagers imitated harmonies in shared spaces where privacy was rare, but rehearsal time was abundant. The environment compressed talent and proximity until collaboration became inevitable rather than planned. Meanwhile, Detroit itself was transforming. Motown Records was formed just a few miles away, building a production system that would standardize hit-making with assembly line precision. The same city that produced automobiles began producing chart-topping singles. For Ross and her peers, this created a narrow but visible corridor. Escape was not abstract. It had a business address. Big things were about to happen. The Supremes conquered America, but the victory left casualties. January 1961, Detroit. 3 teenage girls, Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard, finally broke through the gatekeepers of Motown Records after repeated rejection. They were first known as the Primettes, a sister act to the Primes, later the Temptations. Berry Gordy signed them to Motown after persistence and internal lobbying, placing them inside a hit-making system that was still being engineered like a factory line, rather than a traditional label. The group was renamed the Supremes. By 1964, Motown's production machine aligned perfectly with their sound. On August 31, 1964, Where Did Our Love Go hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, the first of a streak that would define American pop dominance. What followed was statistical acceleration. Between 1964 and 1969, the Supremes achieved 12 #1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100, placing them among the most commercially successful vocal groups in U.S. history. During parts of this period, only the Beatles surpassed their global record sales. It was very rare for a female group to dominate mainstream charts at that scale, but that's exactly what the Supremes did. The machine behind the success was Motown's Hitsville, USA system in Detroit, where songs were assembled by teams of writers and producers, most notably Holland Dozier Holland. But as the hits like Baby Love, Stop in the Name of Love, and You Can't Hurry Love stacked up, the internal structure of the Supremes began to shift. Diana Ross became increasingly positioned as the focal point of marketing, television appearances, and vocal emphasis. The group's identity, once distributed evenly, started consolidating around a single front figure. By 1967, the tension became structural rather than emotional. Florence Ballard, one of the founding members whose voice had been central to the group's early sound, was gradually sidelined. On July 1, 1967, she was officially removed from the group and replaced by Cindy Birdsong, formerly of Patti LaBelle and the Bluebells. The change was not just personnel, it was branding. The group was renamed Diana Ross and the Supremes, signaling to audiences that the ensemble had been re-engineered around a lead. It was no longer a trio. Behind the charts, the consequences were immediate and visible. The Supremes continued to release hits, but the chemistry that defined their earlier recordings began to erode. Ballard's departure became one of Motown's most discussed internal decisions, often cited as a turning point where commercial strategy overtook group cohesion. In parallel, Ross was increasingly positioned for a solo career, a transition Motown quietly prepared while still packaging the group for mass consumption. The group's later years reflected this duality, continued success paired with identity fragmentation. Singles like Love Child still reached #1 in 1968, but they operated within a changing lineup and shifting creative control. The Supremes remained visible on television, toured internationally, and maintained chart presence. Yet, the original trio dynamic was effectively gone. After the group's decline in the early 1970s, the long-term outcomes for its members diverged sharply. Florence Ballard struggled with financial instability and personal challenges. On February 22, 1976, she died in Detroit at the age of 32, officially from coronary thrombosis. Mary Wilson, the last surviving original Supreme, would later spend decades reflecting publicly on the group's internal dynamics and the cost of its rebranding. Meanwhile, Diana Ross transitioned into a solo career. But all the success did not come without pain. The Secret Daughter, The Hidden Affairs, and Motown's most dangerous rumors. In the 1960s, when the Supremes were still a trio, Motown was built to look perfectly controlled from the outside. Clean images, polished performances, strict branding. But inside that system, everything moved too closely together to stay fully separate. Diana Ross was at the center of it. She was no longer just one of the Supremes. She was becoming the face of Motown itself. That meant constant contact with Berry Gordy, the man who ran everything. He decided which songs got pushed, which artists were prioritized, and which careers were shaped next. Meetings were not rare. Studio sessions ran late. Conversations didn't always end when the recording stopped. Over time, what started as professional closeness turned into something that people inside the industry began to notice. It was never announced, never confirmed in public terms at the time, but it was not invisible either. What made it more complicated was timing. Ross was already married to music executive Robert Ellis Silberstein. By the early 1970s, the situation reached a point where private reality could no longer stay fully off stage. On August 14, 1971, Ross gave birth to her daughter, Rhonda Ross Kendrick. The fact that Rhonda's biological father was Berry Gordy was not publicly acknowledged in detail during the early years of her life and was not fully disclosed to Rhonda herself until her teenage years. But that's not all. In 2023, Smokey Robinson publicly confirmed that he and Ross had engaged in a year-long affair during the Motown era. Robinson, who was both an artist and songwriter within the label's core creative circle, was deeply embedded in Motown's early development. He was constantly in and out of Hitsville, USA in Detroit, moving between writing rooms, recording booths, and Berry Gordy's office. Ross, as the rising lead of the Supremes, was in the same spaces almost daily. Their connection formed in that repetition. Late studio hours were normal at Motown. Sessions often ran until the early morning. Artists waited in hallways, listened to each other's sessions through thin walls, and ended up socializing because there was nowhere else to go. The duo remained bonded for a year before moving on. As the Supremes transitioned into Diana Ross and the Supremes, and later as Ross launched her solo career, the story around her success increasingly included speculation about internal favoritism, relationship dynamics, and power structures within the label. These discussions often emerged alongside her professional achievements, including her 1972 portrayal of Billie Holiday in Lady Sings the Blues, which earned her an Academy Award nomination. At the same time, Motown itself was evolving. By the early 1970s, the label had relocated from Detroit to Los Angeles, a move that physically distanced its artists from the original Hitsville environment, but did not erase the interpersonal histories formed there. The transition marked the end of Motown's most concentrated era of collaborative production, but the personal relationships formed during that period continued to be talked about. Oscar glory, Hollywood collapse, and the career that could have been. October 1972, Hollywood. A music superstar stepped into a role most studios considered too heavy, too historical, too emotionally exposed. Diana Ross was cast as Billie Holiday in Lady Sings the Blues, a biographical drama about one of jazz's most tragic figures. The production moved between Los Angeles sound stages and carefully reconstructed nightclub sets, but the real pressure sat off-camera. Motown financed part of the film, making it not just a performance, but a corporate gamble on whether a recording star could cross into serious acting without losing credibility. The gamble worked. At least initially, the film became a major box office success, grossing over $20 million domestically on a reported budget of around $14 million, a strong return for a character-driven biopic in the early 1970s. Critics remained divided on tone and authenticity, but Ross's performance landed with enough force to shift perception. By April 1973, she received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress, becoming one of the few black actresses at the time nominated in that category for a leading role in a biographical film. Inside the industry, the expectation became immediate. Studios began considering her for additional dramatic roles, and the entertainment press framed her as a rare dual-threat artist. The momentum, however, depended on follow-through, and that is where the trajectory began to fracture. In 1975, she starred in Mahogany, directed by Berry Gordy. The film was shot across Chicago, Rome, and the Bahamas, and positioned as a fashion world drama centered on ambition and identity. Commercially, it performed well, earning over $20 million at the box office, but the critical reception was sharply divided. The production became controversial during filming due to reported creative disagreements, scheduling disruptions, and tensions over control of narrative direction. The next turning point arrived in 1978, with The Wiz, a Motown-produced reimagining of The Wizard of Oz featuring an all-black cast. Ross starred alongside Michael Jackson, who was then transitioning from child star to global solo phenomenon. The film carried a production budget exceeding $24 million, which was unusually high for a musical at the time. Directed by Sidney Lumet, it was shot on elaborate New York sound stages with large-scale set designs intended to redefine the musical genre for contemporary audiences. Instead, it became one of the most famous box office failures of the decade, earning roughly $13 million domestically. Critics pointed to tonal inconsistency, uneven pacing, and a mismatch between spectacle and narrative structure. The commercial disappointment was significant enough that it effectively stalled momentum for large-scale musical film adaptations featuring pop stars in leading roles for years afterward. For Ross, the cumulative effect was not an immediate disappearance from film, but the closing of a narrow window. Between 1972 and 1978, she moved from Oscar-nominated newcomer to box office risk in less than a decade. Studios recalibrated expectations, and the industry began to categorize her primarily as a recording artist who occasionally acted. By the end of the decade, the Hollywood pathway that once seemed open had narrowed significantly. Music remained her dominant platform, while film became selective rather than continuous. The promise that began on Oscar night in 1973 dissolved gradually through uneven projects, shifting industry priorities, and the financial caution that followed high-profile box office underperformance. But the real tragedies were still waiting for her: murder, divorce, death, and the public breakdown. February the 1st, 1986, Switzerland. High in the alpine stillness, Diana Ross married Norwegian shipping magnate and mountaineer Arne Næss Jr. The ceremony was kept deliberately private, far removed from the machinery of fame that had followed her since Motown. Næss, an experienced climber with expeditions across Africa and the Himalayas, represented a world that stood in contrast to entertainment, corporate wealth, physical risk, and long stretches of life far from public attention. Ross would later describe him as the love of her life. Things finally seemed to be coming together perfectly. But then, on June 22, 1996, Ross's older brother, Arthur T-Boy Ross, and his wife were found murdered in a suburban home after having been dead for weeks. The case shocked local authorities not only because of its brutality, but because of the delay in discovery, which pointed to isolation. At the time, Ross was on tour in Japan, performing in a country where she had maintained a strong audience base since her early solo years. She was unable to attend the funeral. Then, by early 1999, her marriage began to collapse in public view. Arne Næss Jr. confirmed their separation during a television interview before Ross had issued any personal statement. The announcement introduced instability into what had long been viewed as one of her most grounded personal relationships. It also unfolded in a media environment that was increasingly focused on celebrity private lives. In July 2000, further complications emerged when reports surfaced that another woman was expecting Næss's child, a development that deepened the sense of fracture in the marriage and echoed earlier complexities in her personal life, including her first marriage to Robert Ellis Silberstein and the reality surrounding her daughter, Rhonda Ross Kendrick, whose biological father was Berry Gordy. By 2002, accumulated personal and public strain became visible through Ross's documented struggles with alcohol-related issues. In May and again in August, she entered rehabilitation programs, signaling the need for structured intervention. Later that year, on December 30th, she was arrested in Tucson, Arizona, for driving under the influence. Police reports cited a blood alcohol concentration of approximately 0.20%. This was more than twice the legal limit in most U.S. jurisdictions. The arrest footage and mugshot circulated widely, turning a legal incident into international entertainment news. 2 years later, on January 13, 2004, Arne Næss Jr. died in a climbing accident in South Africa. He fell during an expedition in the Groot Drakenstein Mountains near Cape Town, an area known for technical routes and unpredictable conditions. His death closed the final chapter of a relationship that had begun in Alpine, quiet nearly 2 decades earlier, and ended through separation, public scrutiny, and geographic distance. This brings us to her life as it is now. At 82, she is the last witness to a vanishing era. At 82, the timeline around Diana Ross reads like a historical archive walking in real time. The Motown generation that once surrounded her has largely disappeared. Florence Ballard, one of her original Supremes bandmates, died in 1976 at just 32. Marvin Gaye was killed in 1984 in Los Angeles at age 44. Michael Jackson, who once shared the screen with her in The Wiz, died in 2009 at 50. Across decades, collaborators, producers, and chart rivals have fallen out of the cultural present, leaving Ross positioned less as a contemporary and more as a surviving reference point to an entire musical ecosystem. That ecosystem, Motown's Detroit era of the 1960s, once functioned like a tightly engineered sound factory. Hits were produced through concentrated teams, studio musicians, and tightly controlled release schedules. Ross emerged from that system not just as a performer, but as its most visible export. Now, decades later, she remains one of the last direct human links to that original structure,
where Hitsville, USA operated out of a modest house on West Grand Boulevard, and where chart dominance was built through repetition, discipline, and assembly line precision.
In March 2025, as she approached her 81st birthday, Ross publicly reaffirmed that she has no intention of retiring, continuing to perform live shows that still sell out major venues. Very few artists from the 1960s remain active on stage at all, and fewer still maintain demand at scale. On May 5, 2025, she returned to the Met Gala in New York for the first time in 22 years. The appearance itself was structured like a visual statement rather than a simple red carpet walk. She wore a gown featuring an 18-foot train embroidered with the names of her children and grandchildren. The symbolism was difficult to separate from the context. The Met Gala appearance placed her inside a contemporary cultural space dominated by younger artists, designers, and digital-era celebrities. Yet her presence carried a different kind of visibility. Not emerging relevance, but sustained longevity. Within that framing, Ross's career is increasingly defined by survivorship within a shrinking cohort. She is no longer part of a peer group in the traditional sense. The Motown figures she once worked alongside, competed with, or was compared against have either passed away or moved fully into retirement and legacy status. What remains is a narrowing circle of living memory.
She is among the last of her kind. Life has been generous, and it has been treacherous all the same. But she has decided to move on.
Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.